The classroom buzzed with the usual energy of a Monday morning, students chatting in low murmurs, papers rustling, and the faint scrape of chairs being adjusted. Sitting at the back of the room, a young boy kept his head down, sketching quietly in his notebook. He was new to the school, and while others exchanged glances or whispered about him, he didn't seem bothered. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he looked like any other student, except for one thing: the way he carried himself. There was a calmness about him, a quiet focus, like someone who had a lot going on beneath the surface. Entered the teacher. She strode into the room with a stack of papers under her arm and an air of authority that silenced the chatter almost instantly. She was known for her strict demeanor and no-nonsense attitude, the kind of teacher who expected discipline and didn't tolerate what she called distractions. Spotting the boy at the back, she paused. His lack of eye contact and casual posture rubbed her the wrong way. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the quiet. "You must be the new student. Stand up and introduce yourself to the class." The boy hesitated, his pencil hovering above the notebook. He looked up slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers, and there was a flicker of something, maybe nervousness, maybe defiance. He stood, but instead of introducing himself, he simply said, "My name isn't important right now." The room fell silent. A few students exchanged wide-eyed looks, sensing the tension. The teacher frowned, clearly unimpressed. "This is my classroom," she said firmly. "And in my classroom, everyone participates. So, why don't you tell us something about yourself?" The boy glanced around, the weight of all those eyes on him. Then, with a calm voice, he said, "There's not much to say. I'm here to learn. That's all." The teacher's frown deepened. "Well, if you're here to learn," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm, "you might want to start by learning some respect." Laughter rippled through the class, though it was uneasy, like no one was sure if they should find this funny. The boy sat down without another word, his expression unreadable. As the lesson went on, the teacher seemed to have it out for him. Every little thing he did, whether it was flipping a page too loudly or writing something when she was speaking, seemed to draw her attention. At one point, she even stopped the class entirely to call him out. "Do you have something more important to do than listen?" she asked, folding her arms across her chest. "No, ma'am," he replied evenly, his tone respectful but unshaken. "Then maybe you'd like to come up here and solve this problem for us," she said, pointing to a complicated equation on the board. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile that said she was waiting for him to fail, to prove her point. The boy hesitated for a moment, then stood and walked to the front. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. He picked up the marker, studied the problem for a moment, and then without hesitation began writing. It wasn't just that he solved the problem. It was how he solved it. His movements were quick but deliberate, his calculations flowing seamlessly across the board. By the time he put the marker down, the room was frozen in stunned silence. The teacher's jaw tightened as she looked at the board, then back at him. "Lucky guess," she said, her voice clipped. The boy didn't respond. He simply returned to his seat, his face calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. But the class wasn't fooled. Whispers started to spread, murmurs about how he had solved it faster than anyone they'd seen, even faster than the teacher. As the day went on, it became clear that this boy wasn't just another student. In every subject, he seemed to grasp the material effortlessly, answering questions others struggled with and even pointing out errors in the textbook. The teacher's frustration grew. It wasn't just that he was smart, it was that he didn't seem to care about impressing her or anyone else. But then, something happened that changed everything. Near the end of the day, the boy pulled out a small notebook during a free period. It wasn't for homework. Instead, it was filled with detailed diagrams, equations, and notes written in tiny, precise handwriting. A curious student sitting next to him peeked over and asked, "What's that?" The boy hesitated, then shrugged. "Just something I'm working on." The teacher happened to overhear this and couldn't resist. "Oh, let me guess," she said, her tone mocking. "You've decided to reinvent the wheel, have you?" The boy didn't answer. He closed the notebook and put it back in his bag. But what neither the teacher nor the other students knew was that the notebook wasn't just a collection of random ideas. It was the blueprint for something extraordinary, something that would soon leave them all speechless. And that's when the real story begins. The day ended with a heavy air lingering in the classroom. The teacher's frustration was palpable, and the students couldn't stop buzzing about what they had seen. The boy, however, walked out of the room just as quietly as he had entered, his bag slung over one shoulder, his face unreadable. As the students spilled into the hallways, their chatter grew louder. "Did you see how he solved that problem? It was like he didn't even have to think about it. What do you think he's writing in that notebook?" The whispers followed him, but he didn't seem to notice, or maybe he just didn't care. Outside, the boy walked toward the bike rack where his old, worn-out bicycle waited. He unlocked it and started pedaling, weaving through the crowd of kids heading home. It was a chilly afternoon, the kind that made you pull your jacket a little tighter. As he rode through the neighborhood, his mind was somewhere else entirely. He didn't live far from the school, but his neighborhood looked nothing like the tree-lined streets most of his classmates went home to. The houses were smaller, closer together, with peeling paint and chain-link fences. His own house was no different, a small, single-story home with a sagging porch and a yard overgrown with weeds. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. He set his bag down by the door and called out, "I'm home." No response. He walked into the kitchen, where a few dishes sat piled in the sink. On the table, there was a note scribbled on a piece of scrap paper, "Working late. There's food in the fridge. Love, Mom." He sighed, crumpling the note in his hand before tossing it into the trash. It wasn't the first time she'd had to stay late at the diner where she worked. He knew she was doing her best, trying to make ends meet, but that didn't make the house feel any less empty. The boy grabbed a sandwich from the fridge and headed to his room. His space was small, just big enough for a bed, a desk, and a few shelves crammed with books and notebooks. On one wall, there were posters of scientists and inventors, people like Albert Einstein, Katherine Johnson, and Nikola Tesla. But most of the wall space was taken up by papers he taped up, sketches, formulas, and ideas that seemed to spill out of his mind faster than he could organize them. He sat down at his desk, opened his notebook, and began writing. His pencil moved quickly, the sound of it scratching against the paper filling the room. This wasn't homework. This was something much bigger, something he'd been working on for months. The boy didn't just excel in school, he thought differently. While other kids were learning basic algebra, he was working out problems in advanced physics. While they played video games, he was building models of machines that only existed in his imagination. And while they worried about grades, he was focused on something much more important. What the boy was working on in his notebook wasn't just a collection of ideas. It was the solution to a problem he'd been obsessed with for years, something he believed could change the world. But he kept it to himself. He'd learned a long time ago that not everyone understood the way his mind worked. The next day, at school, things felt different. The other students watched him more closely now, whispering to each other as he walked by. Even the teacher seemed to be on edge. During class, she kept glancing at him, her expression unreadable. But the boy ignored it all. He kept his head down, taking notes and solving problems in his usual quiet way. That is, until the teacher decided to make an example of him. "Since our new student seems to think he's so clever," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge, "maybe he'd like to explain to the class how he solved yesterday's problem." The boy looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He could see the challenge in her gaze, the way she was daring him to speak. "It's just math," he said simply. "Just math?" she repeated, her tone mocking. "Well, if it's just math, then surely you can explain it in a way the rest of us can understand. He hesitated. He didn't like being put on the spot, especially not in front of the whole class. But he stood up anyway, walking to the board with a calmness that made the room go quiet. He picked up the marker and began to explain, his voice steady and confident. As he spoke, the equations and diagrams seemed to come alive, and for a moment, even the teacher was silent. She didn't want to admit it, but she couldn't deny the brilliance in what he was saying. When he finished, the class erupted into applause. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was genuine awe. But the teacher's face hardened. She didn't like being shown up, especially not by a student. "That's enough," she said, cutting the applause short. "Take your seat." The boy did as he was told, but he couldn't ignore the shift in the room. The other students looked at him differently now, not with judgment, but with curiosity. At lunch, a small group of kids approached him, their trays in hand. One of them, a girl with a kind smile, asked, "Can we sit with you?" He shrugged, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to people wanting to be around him. As they sat down, they started asking questions. "How do you know so much? What's in your notebook? Do you really like math, or are you just really good at it?" The boy answered their questions as best as he could, but he kept his notebook closed. It wasn't that he didn't trust them, it was just that what he was working on felt too personal, too important to share. Later that afternoon, during a free period, he went to the library. He liked it there, the quiet, the smell of old books, the way it felt like a world away from everything else. He found a table in the back and opened his notebook, losing himself in his work. But he wasn't alone. The teacher had followed him, her curiosity getting the better of her. She stood at the end of the aisle, watching him for a moment before speaking. "What are you working on?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. The boy looked up, startled. He closed the notebook quickly, his guard going up. "Nothing important," he said. The teacher frowned. "You know, you're a very bright student. But intelligence doesn't mean much if you don't use it for something meaningful." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the boy considered telling her the truth. But then he remembered the way she had treated him, the way she had humiliated him in front of the class. "I know," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. The teacher hesitated, as if she wanted to say more, but then she turned and walked away. As the boy watched her leave, he felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite place. He knew she didn't understand him. No one did. But that was okay. Because soon they would. And when they did, nothing would ever be the same. The days passed, and the whispers around the school only grew louder. The boy was no longer just a quiet new kid. He had become a mystery, a puzzle everyone wanted to figure out. Some students admired him, while others couldn't decide if he was a genius or just plain strange. But no one could deny that there was something extraordinary about him. The teacher, however, seemed to grow more tense with each passing day. It wasn't just the boy's intelligence that unsettled her, it was the way he carried himself, as if he didn't need anyone's approval. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, and it frustrated her to no end. One afternoon, during a science lesson, the teacher decided to test him again. She pulled up a complex concept, one that she knew was far beyond the curriculum. "Let's see if anyone in this class can figure this out," she said, writing an elaborate equation on the board. The class looked at the equation, their eyes glazing over. It was clear no one had a clue where to even begin except for him. The boy raised his hand, his voice calm and steady. "It's wrong." The teacher froze, the marker still in her hand. "Excuse me?" "The equation," he said, sitting straighter in his chair. "There's a mistake in it." A ripple of murmurs spread across the classroom. The teacher's face turned red, a mix of embarrassment and anger. "Are you suggesting I made an error?" The boy nodded, then stood up and walked to the board. He didn't ask for permission, he just picked up the marker and began correcting the equation. His movements were precise, his focus unwavering. By the time he was done, the board was filled with lines of calculations that none of the other students could follow. He put the marker down and turned to face the class. "That's how it should look," he said simply before walking back to his seat. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. For a moment, the teacher said nothing. She just stared at the board, her jaw clenched. Then, without a word, she erased the entire thing and moved on with the lesson. But that moment lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The boy wasn't just smart, he was operating on a level none of them could understand. That evening, as the boy worked at his desk, he felt a strange unease. He flipped through his notebook, his pencil moving faster than usual. The designs were coming together now, the pieces fitting into place like a puzzle. He was so close to finishing what he had been working on for months. But something didn't feel right. He glanced at the corner of his room, where an old box sat. Inside were newspaper clippings, articles about his father, a man who had been a brilliant inventor but whose work had been stolen by people who didn't believe someone like him could be capable of such ideas. The boy clenched his fists, the memory of those headlines flashing in his mind. Crazy, they had called his father. A fraud. The boy shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. He wouldn't let that happen to him. He would prove them all wrong. The next day at school, the tension between him and the teacher reached a breaking point. She assigned a group project, pairing him with a few students who were clearly intimidated by him. As they worked together, one of the students asked, "Why don't you just tell the teacher what you're working on? Maybe she'll back off." The boy shook his head. She wouldn't understand. But as the day went on, he began to feel the weight of the attention on him. It wasn't just the students and the teacher, it was the entire school. Everywhere he went, people were watching him, whispering about him. And then it happened. During lunch, as he sat alone at his usual spot, a group of older students approached him. They weren't friendly. One of them leaned over his table, sneering. "So, you think you're better than everyone else, huh?" The boy didn't respond. He kept his eyes on his food, trying to ignore them. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the student said, grabbing the boy's notebook. "Give it back," the boy said, his voice low but firm. The student flipped through the pages, his expression turning from smug to confused. "What is this stuff? It doesn't even make sense." The boy stood up, his hands clenched into fists. "I said, give it back." The tension was thick, the cafeteria silent as everyone watched the scene unfold. Just as it seemed like things were about to escalate, a teacher stepped in, breaking up the group and handing the notebook back to the boy. But the damage was done. The boy's work was no longer a secret. By the end of the day, the rumors had spread like wildfire. Students whispered about the strange equations and diagrams in his notebook, speculating about what they could mean. Even the teachers seemed curious, their glances lingering on him longer than usual. The boy felt the pressure building, the weight of all those eyes on him. But he didn't let it show. He kept his head down, his focus sharp. That night, as he sat at his desk, he realized there was no turning back. Whatever happened next, he would have to face it head on. And somewhere deep down, he knew that the moment he had been dreading was coming. The question wasn't if they would find out what he was working on. The question was what they would do once they did. That night, as the boy sat hunched over his notebook, something shifted. The numbers on the page seemed to blur, not from exhaustion but from the growing unease gnawing at him. He glanced over his shoulder, feeling like someone was watching him, though the house was as quiet as ever. Shaking it off, he focused again, scribbling furiously as if the solution he was chasing might slip away if he didn't move fast enough. But just as his pencil scratched out the final line of a calculation, a loud knock shattered the silence. His heart leapt into his throat. He wasn't expecting anyone. He froze, his hand hovering over the notebook. Another knock. louder this time. He cautiously walked to the front door, his steps echoing in the stillness of the house. Peeking through the peephole, he saw a shadowy figure standing under the flickering porch light. It wasn't his mother. She wouldn't knock. "Who is it?" he called out, trying to steady his voice. "Open up," the voice said, gruff and unfamiliar. "We need to talk." The boy's grip tightened on the doorknob, his instincts screaming not to open it. He backed away, his mind racing. Who would come here? And why now? As he retreated, the knocking turned into pounding, each bang rattling the thin walls of the house. Panicked, he grabbed his notebook and shoved it into his bag. He couldn't let anyone see it, not after what had happened at school. But before he could think of a place to hide, the pounding stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, he thought they had left. Then he heard the sound of footsteps crunching through the gravel outside. Whoever it was hadn't given up. They were circling the house. He crept to the back window, peeking through the curtains just in time to see a man in a dark jacket walking away, his phone pressed to his ear. The boy couldn't make out what he was saying, but the way he moved sent a chill down his spine. Who were they? And how did they know where he lived? The next morning at school, the boy couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers in the hallway were louder than usual, the stares more obvious. Even the teacher seemed distracted, her eyes darting to him every few minutes during class.at lunch. The girl who had sat with him before approached his table again, this time with a worried look on her face. "Hey," she said, glancing around nervously. "Have you heard the rumors?" "What rumors?" he asked, his voice low. "People are saying the principal called some outsiders to look into you. Like government people or something. They think it has to do with whatever's in your notebook." His stomach dropped. He tried to play it cool, but the fear must have shown on his face because she leaned in closer. "Is it true? Is there really something big in there?" The boy hesitated. He wanted to tell her the truth, to explain that his work wasn't dangerous, it was groundbreaking. But he couldn't risk it. "It's just math," he said, forcing a shrug. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push him either. "Well, whatever it is, you should be careful. People are acting weird." And they were. By the end of the day, it felt like the entire school was buzzing with speculation. Even the teacher seemed more agitated than usual, snapping at students for the smallest things. When the boy handed in his assignment, she didn't even look at it, she just glared at him like he was a problem she couldn't solve. After school, as he rode his bike home, he noticed a black car parked a few houses down from his. The windows were tinted, and the engine idled quietly. He tried to ignore it, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he passed. Once inside, he locked the door behind him and went straight to his room. He pulled out his notebook, flipping through the pages with a growing sense of urgency. He needed to finish this, whatever it was. Not just for himself, but for his father's legacy. But as he worked, a new thought crept into his mind. What if someone was trying to take it from him, just like they had taken everything from his father? What if this time, he couldn't stop them? The sound of a car door slamming outside jolted him from his thoughts. He peeked out the window and saw two men in suits walking toward his house. They looked official to official. Panic set in. He grabbed his bag, shoving his notebook inside along with a few essentials. He couldn't stay here. He had to leave, at least until he could figure out what was going on. Just as the men knocked on the door, the boy slipped out the back, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. As he ran through the alleyways of his neighborhood, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The stakes had never been higher, and now, it wasn't just about proving himself. It was about survival. Because whoever was after him wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted. And the boy wasn't about to let that happen. The boy darted through the narrow streets, his bag bouncing against his back with every step. His mind raced, trying to piece together who those men were and why they were after him. Was it his notebook? His designs? Or something else entirely? He didn't have time to figure it out. All he knew was that if they caught him, it was over. He finally stopped in an abandoned lot a few blocks away, gasping for air. He crouched behind an old dumpster, pulling the notebook from his bag. The pages were smudged from his frantic handling, but the equations and diagrams were still clear. He flipped to the last page he'd been working on, the one that held the key to everything. The device wasn't just an invention, it was a breakthrough. Something that could change the way people lived, worked, and communicated. But it wasn't just a technological marvel, it was personal. It was the culmination of everything his father had taught him, every lesson, every story. And now, it was a target. As he stared at the page, he heard the faint crunch of footsteps nearby. His heart sank. They'd found him. He stuffed the notebook back into his bag and took off again, weaving through alleyways and cutting through backyards. He could hear voices now, low and urgent, calling out to each other. They weren't far behind. He turned a corner and nearly collided with the girl from school. She looked just as startled as he was. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "I could ask you the same thing," he shot back, his voice trembling. "I followed you," she admitted, her eyes wide with worry. "Those men, they're not who they say they are." "What do you mean?" "I overheard them talking to the principal," she said, pulling him further into the shadows. "They're not from the government. They're from some private company. They want your work. They think it's worth a fortune." The boy's stomach churned. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. Why would they go through all this trouble? "It's just a notebook." The girl shook her head. "It's not just a notebook, is it?" Before he could answer, a flashlight beam swept across the alleyway, missing them by inches. The voices were closer now, and the urgency in them was unmistakable. "You have to hide," she said, her voice firm. "I'll distract them." "No," he said, grabbing her arm. "It's too dangerous." But she was already moving, stepping out into the open just as the men rounded the corner. She waved her arms, shouting, "Hey! Over here!" The men turned toward her, their focus shifting just long enough for the boy to slip away unnoticed. He didn't want to leave her behind, but he knew he didn't have a choice. He ran until his legs burned, finally reaching an old workshop on the edge of town. It was a place he and his father used to visit, filled with tools and parts that had been left untouched for years. He locked the door behind him and collapsed onto the floor, his chest heaving. For a moment, he thought he was safe. But then he heard a voice, low and familiar, coming from the shadows. "You've been busy," the teacher said, stepping into the light. The boy's blood ran cold. "What are you doing here?" She held up her hands, as if to show she wasn't a threat. "I'm not with them," she said. "I came to help." "Why should I believe you?" "Because I know what they're after," she said, her voice steady. "And I know what it's worth." The boy hesitated, his mind racing. Could he trust her? Before he could decide, the door burst open, and the men stormed in. The teacher stepped in front of him, her arms outstretched. "Stop!" she shouted. "You don't know what you're dealing with." The men ignored her, advancing toward the boy. But just as they reached for him, the boy pulled a small device from his bag, the prototype he'd been working on for months. He pressed a button, and the room filled with a blinding light. When the light faded, the men were gone. The teacher looked at him, stunned. "What? What just happened?" The boy held up the device, his hands trembling. "It's not just an invention," he said. "It's a safeguard." The teacher nodded slowly, understanding dawning on her face. "Your father's work," she said softly. "You finished it." The boy nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "But they'll keep coming," he said. They won't stop. Then we'll make sure they can't, the teacher said, her voice firm. And as the two of them stood in the quiet workshop, the boy realized that he wasn't alone anymore. For the first time, he had an ally. Someone who believed in him. But just as relief began to wash over him, a shadow moved outside the window. The boy's heart sank. The fight wasn't over yet. It never would be. The shadow outside the window moved closer, and the boy's breath caught in his throat. He clutched the device in his hand, his fingers trembling. He looked at the teacher, her expression a mix of determination and fear. She whispered, "We'll handle this. Stay calm." The boy nodded, though calm was the last thing he felt. The two of them moved quietly to the back of the workshop, slipping behind a row of old machinery. The boy's heart raced as he tried to think. If the men were back and if they knew what he had done, there would be no reasoning with them. They wanted his work, and they wouldn't stop until they had it. The sound of footsteps grew louder, deliberate, and steady. A flashlight beam swept across the room, briefly illuminating the dusty workbenches and shelves. The boy gripped the device tighter, debating whether to activate it again. The teacher leaned in and whispered, "Not yet. Let them show their hand first." The door creaked open, and one of the men stepped inside. He was taller than the others, with a presence that immediately filled the room. He wasn't like the ones who had come before. He didn't seem frantic or desperate. Instead, he exuded a cold, calculated confidence. His eyes scanned the workshop, and when they landed on the boy's bag, still sitting on the floor near the doorway, his lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Clever," the man said, his voice smooth and unnervingly calm. "But you're not as hidden as you think." The boy's pulse quickened. He felt the teacher's hand on his arm, steadying him. "Listen to me," she whispered. "No matter what happens, don't let them take the device." The man took a step closer to the bag, his eyes never leaving it. "You know," he said, speaking into the room as if he knew they could hear him, "what you've created here is remarkable. Revolutionary. Even. But it's wasted on you. You're just a kid. You don't understand its potential." The boy felt a surge of anger at the man's words, but he stayed quiet. The man crouched down, reaching for the bag. "You've had your fun. Now, it's time for the professionals to take over." Before he could grab it, the teacher stepped out from behind the machinery, her arms crossed. "That's far enough," she said, her voice steady. The man straightened, his smile widening. "Ah, the teacher," he said. "I was wondering when you'd show yourself. Do you really think you can stop this?" "I think you underestimate us," she replied. The man chuckled, shaking his head. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But bravery won't change the outcome." As he reached for the bag again, the boy stepped out, holding the device in front of him. The man froze, his eyes narrowing. "Ah," he said, his tone shifting. "There it is." The boy's hands were shaking, but his voice was firm. "You don't understand what this is. You don't understand what it can do." The man tilted his head, intrigued. "Why don't you enlighten me?" The boy hesitated. He didn't want to reveal too much, but he also needed to buy time. "This isn't just a machine," he said. "It's a safeguard. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could cause more harm than good." "And you think your hands are the right ones?" the man asked, taking a step closer. The teacher moved to stand between them, her stance protective. "He's not giving it to you," she said. The man sighed, as if disappointed. "It's a shame," he said. "I was hoping we could do this the easy way." Before anyone could react, the man lunged toward the boy, but the teacher was quicker. She grabbed a wrench from a nearby workbench and swung it, forcing the man to stumble back. "Run!" she shouted to the boy. But the boy didn't run. He pressed a button on the device, and once again, the room filled with blinding light. When it faded, the man was gone, just like the others. The boy and the teacher stood in silence, the air around them still and heavy. Finally, the boy lowered the device, his hands still trembling. Did I send him away?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The teacher nodded. "I think you did," she said. The boy sank to the floor, exhaustion and relief washing over him. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he said. "You didn't," the teacher reassured him. "You just protected yourself. And you protected your work." They sat there for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened settling over them. Finally, the teacher spoke again. "You know this isn't over, right?" "They'll keep coming." The boy nodded. "I know," he said. "But I won't stop fighting. Not for this." The teacher placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to do it alone anymore," she said. In the weeks that followed, the boy and the teacher worked together to secure his invention. They moved it to a safe location, one that no one could trace. The teacher used her connections to help spread the word about the boy's work, not to expose him, but to build a network of people who could protect him and his ideas. The girl from school became part of their team, too. She proved to be resourceful and brave, using her quick thinking to help divert attention away from the boy when things got too heated. For the first time, the boy felt like he wasn't carrying the burden alone. As the months passed, the men who had pursued him seemed to disappear. Whether it was because of the device's safeguards or because they realized they couldn't outsmart the boy and his team, he didn't know. But he didn't let his guard down. He continued to work on his designs, not for fame or fortune, but to honor his father's legacy. Every line he drew, every calculation he made, was a step toward proving that brilliance could come from anyone, no matter their age, background, or circumstances. One day, as he sat at his desk, he glanced at an old photo of his father. He smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. "I'll keep going," he whispered. "I'll make you proud." And with that, he picked up his pencil and began to draw. The teacher, watching from the doorway, smiled. She didn't say anything she didn't need to. She knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, the boy was ready for them. Because he wasn't just a prodigy. He was a fighter. A survivor. And his story was just beginning.